The iPad, when it came out, completely changed the way people looked at mobile devices. It was seen as the perfect in-between for your smartphone and computer, and as a result, the first iPad was a wild success. And in 2011, Apple released the second ever iPad, bringing a massive amount of improvements along with it. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and today we're talking about the iPad 2, and how it holds up in 2019. Before we get into this, you should definitely go follow me over on Twitter and Instagram. At the moment, I don't really have a sarcastic quip as to why you should, but you should. The iPad 2 has always been one of the biggest upgrades to any Apple product, and what I find crazy is that they did it only a year after the first one came out. It brought a front and back camera, a significantly thinner body, a dual-core processor, and overall it significantly felt more like the future everyone was hyping tablets up to be. Keep in mind, back when the iPad 2 was released, tablets, at least on the Android side, sucked. The iPad 2 blew everything out of the water by a long shot, and so perhaps it shouldn't be surprising it received a full 5 years of support, all the way up till 2016 with iOS 9. iOS 9 is both a blessing and a cursing, and I'll get into that, but regardless, the iPad 2 was well built for the future, and it deserves credit for that. But let's back up here and start with the design and how it holds up in 2019. The iPad 2 has that classic iPad design in that it has an aluminum curved backing, a glass display with thick black bezels, and of course the classic home button. The iPad 2 is surprisingly thin and light. It's chunky compared to modern iPads, but it's totally usable in one hand and it feels a lot better than its predecessor. We have the classic 30-pin charger connector port on the bottom, which can be a bit annoying to use nowadays in comparison to Lightning. On the other hand, I think pretty much everyone has at least some of these old 30-pin chargers lying around in their drawers, so with an iPad 2, at least they'll get use. We have the headphone jack on top, and yes, before you say anything, it does have a headphone jack, but even modern iPads still have headphone jacks minus the iPad Pro, so I mean, can't make all the same jokes you do with iPhones. We have black plastic buttons on the side of the device, which is kind of interesting in the sense we don't see them anymore. Turning on the iPad, we have slide to unlock, the other way, and it honestly doesn't look that old, right? Like, this looks fairly modern, and it's because it is. This is iOS 9, and iOS 9 is only a few versions behind, so it has the modern look and feel of iOS. I would say straight up, this device looks really good like this, to be honest. It's not a bad looking device at all, and it even looks kind of similar to what iPads we have today. I mean, here's the iPad Air versus the iPad 2, and yeah, this one has thinner bezels and all, and I mean, it looks sleeker, but this doesn't look that much different, all things considered. When it comes to iPad, Apple kind of kept using the same design, or same general design, for a really long time, and that's a trend that continued up until last year with the new iPad Pro, where it just got rid of the home button, and well, frankly, I think it looks really good, being nearly bezel-less. But anyway, I'm just mentioning it because I find it interesting how well these old iPads kind of hold up from the front. They don't look that old. This display itself looks good on camera, but in real life it really isn't. It's not terrible by any means, but it feels dated by 2019 standards, and that's because it doesn't have a Retina display. We're looking at a 9.7-inch screen with 132 pixels per inch, which is mediocre, to put it lightly. You're not going to get the clean and crisp images you are on any Retina iPad, and that's something that you'll probably notice if you try using one of these in 2019. Don't get me wrong, the display of the iPad 2 shouldn't be a deal breaker. It's not bad, it's just not as good as we're used to nowadays. Above the screen, you'll see the front-facing camera. It's bad, like laughably bad. It has 0.3 megapixels, and well, technically it does take a selfie, I suppose. If you can make out my face in this pixelated mess, you'll see the iPad isn't particularly strong in this area. But in its defense, at least it has a selfie camera. The iPad 1 didn't have a selfie camera, so taking that into perspective, it does make things look a little bit better. And that goes for the rear camera as well. It only has 0.7 megapixels, which to my knowledge is the worst rear camera Apple's ever put on an iOS device. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. Actually, I was curious, so I just did some searching. The first iPhone had 2 megapixels, so while pictures might actually look better on the iPad due to other various improvements, the first iPhone did have a higher megapixel count, so there's that. I checked the iPod Touch 4 because I knew that it didn't have a very good camera, and it's actually the exact same camera, so I guess Apple decided to just reuse it with the iPad 2, which would have come out a year later after this, or at least the next year, maybe not exactly a year later. I think this was a little bit lazy on Apple's part. I would have liked to see the iPhone 4 camera in the iPad 2, considering it was like 5 megapixels and way better. But I mean, at least it does have a camera, and somehow it can film up to 720p. The resolution 720p, it certainly doesn't look 720p. I mean, you can see it on the screen here. It looks awful. In its defense, when my family got this iPad when I was a kid, I thought it was the coolest thing ever, and I did a lot of filming with it. So, hey, it's not like people didn't use the camera. Anyways, now I'll put up some more photos for you to see for yourself. Battery life is actually one of the best aspects of the iPad 2. This will vary device to device, but mine's one that hasn't been used too heavily over its lifetime, and so it still holds a charge pretty well. It has a full 6,930 milliamp hours, which is pretty big, and personally I haven't experienced any issues. You can use this iPad for like multiple days, or at least I can. Spec wise, the iPad 2 is pretty darn good for 2011. In fact, I'd say it's actually too good, and I'll explain why in a moment. But we had the Apple A5 chipset, which was the first dual-core processor from Apple, and a full 512 megabytes of RAM. When the iPad launched with iOS 4, it absolutely blew everything else out of the water in terms of speeds, and it would continue to fly up until about iOS 7 or 8. While this hardware was a huge jump for Apple, you have to keep in mind that back in these days, almost every year would bring a big jump in power, and so this wasn't terribly out of the norm. Heck, only 2 years later, the iPhone 5S came out with a 64-bit architecture, the first phone to do it, and as a result, that phone is still updatable right now to iOS 12. But because the iPad 2 was quite far ahead, it actually suffered a pretty terrible fate, what I'm gonna call accidental obsolescence. If you've ever heard of planned obsolescence, basically it's the idea or notion that a company intentionally slows down their product or makes it unusable so that the consumer has to buy a new one. This is something people accuse Apple of doing for years, but that's more or less quieted down now that Apple's giving their phones like 5 to 6 years of support, which is something that no one else does. Most Android phones get like 2 to 3 years of support, and unless it's a Google Pixel or whatever, the updates are usually months behind when Google originally releases them, so Apple is far ahead of everyone else in this category. But if you were to argue that Apple does follow the idea of planned obsolescence, then the iPad 2 as well as any Apple device with the A5 chipset are the examples you want to use, because they aged horribly. What am I saying here? The iPad 2 is brutally slow on iOS 9. Apple never should have given it the update. It probably shouldn't have updated past iOS 7, but you know, iOS 8 isn't terrible. It's pretty bad, but it's not like horrible like iOS 9 is. The iPad struggles with nearly everything. From opening basic apps to web browsing to you name it. It's enough to drive anybody crazy, and it's a pity Apple let it update this far along. I think this was accidental obsolescence in the sense that Apple saw the iPad 2 and the iPhone 4S and all those and said, hey, it's dual core, it's technically capable of running the newest update, so why not just give it iOS 8? Why not just give it iOS 9? What's the harm? Well, the harm was that it was super slow and it screwed over a lot of people who couldn't really use those devices very well anymore. Yeah, it didn't work out, and I think Apple's learned their lesson, especially considering the iPhone 6 isn't getting iOS 13, even though it probably could if they really wanted it to. People might disagree with me on this one, but I think it's a good thing the iPhone 6 isn't getting iOS 13, because frankly, that means it'll always be relatively fast. iOS 12 is pretty good, and 13 probably would have slowed it down quite a bit. I might just have to do another full video on this because it is kind of an interesting topic, so I'll move on. In spite of the sluggish speeds, one advantage of iOS 9 is that you get relatively modern versions of most apps from the App Store. Currently, the average required version is iOS 10 for most apps, although that doesn't qualify for everything. Facebook, for example, only requires iOS 9, which I just found out and is surprising. So if you're running iOS 9, you can get the latest version of Facebook. Mind you, I don't know why you'd want to use Facebook, but you can. For most apps, however, you'll have to download the latest compatible version, which usually isn't too out of date considering iOS 9 was supported by most apps like last year, and YouTube is a good example of this. Unfortunately, things like support with some apps like Facebook and apps not feeling too outdated because they were recently supported, that's something that's not going to last forever, and as time goes on, the apps are going to feel more and more outdated, and I mean, that goes without saying. But in 2019, the iPad 2 feels somewhat current in what it can do, if you can live with the again horrible speeds. And honestly, you probably can if you're just doing the basics of basics. Obviously, gaming and even general web browsing is going to be a bit of a pain, but stuff that doesn't require a lot of constant interaction like Netflix or maybe YouTube can be quite well once you get the movie or video loaded up. If you just need a device for media streaming or I don't know, really light gaming, maybe games that came out back in the day when the iPad 2 was usable, it's not terrible. I could see it being useful as a Netflix machine or maybe a tablet for a younger child who just wants a tablet. If for some reason you want to pick one up, you can. They're on eBay or Craigslist or wherever, and they often go for around $50 US, which isn't a horrible price. I just don't know why you'd want to pick one up. If you already have one, that's one thing, but going out and buying one is probably not going to be a good idea. You can get a lot better value in an older iPad Air or a iPad 4 or any of those newer, better iPads. And if you really don't like iOS 9, like me, and you're not too worried about having a slightly older version of a lot of apps, you can downgrade to iOS 8. And it's actually not a difficult process, assuming you can jailbreak the device. I'll post a link to it in the description. There are some iPad 2s that can downgrade to iOS 6, however, they are kind of hard to find. Basically, some of the oldest versions of iPad 2s can run iOS 6. You can install it on there. Again, link to that in the description below. It's not a hard process to do, and I don't know why you'd really want to run iOS 6 other than for nostalgia, but if you do, that might be something worth looking into. At the end of the day, the iPad 2 was a really great device. It was top of the line and had everything else, including the first iPad, beat by a long shot. But Apple kept it alive for too long, and as a result, it's really hard to use it in 2019. So as much as I hate to say it, the iPad 2 does not hold up well today, at least not on the software side. But that's enough for me. I want to hear from you. Did you ever own an iPad 2? Did you ever want one? Do you still own one? Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this video interesting, you can always hit that like button and maybe consider subscribing for more content just like this. You can follow me over on Twitter and Instagram at 91_tech if you'd like. And with that all being said, I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.